Back in the year 2017, there was a young woman who had just turned 21 years old, and she was feeling completely lost. She had no real direction in life, her relationships were crumbling, and she was desperate to find a way out of her current living situation. At the time, she was living with her parents, but their house did not feel like a home. It felt more like a pressure cooker. After dropping out of college during her very first year, her parents had essentially written her off. They looked at her with a mix of anger and disappointment, and her sister had stopped talking to her altogether. The tension in that house was so thick you could cut it with a knife. To make matters worse, she was working a dead-end job at a local vape shop, earning just enough money to get by, but not nearly enough to afford her own apartment. She spent her days standing behind a glass counter, surrounded by sweet-smelling vapor, wishing she could be anywhere else. She called this period of her life her attitude era because she was angry, defensive, and willing to take risks just to change her circumstances. She wanted to escape the daily arguments, the constant criticism, and the feeling that she was a complete failure in the eyes of her family. One afternoon, while hiding in the back room of the vape shop to avoid her boss, she opened up Craigslist on her phone. She was just scrolling through the local listings, not really expecting to find anything useful, when a post caught her eye. It was an advertisement for free lodging in exchange for housekeeping duties. The poster was a man named Jackson. He explained in the listing that he owned a large house, worked long hours, and needed someone to keep the place clean and occasionally prepare meals. In exchange, this person would get their own private bedroom and live completely rent-free. There were 10 photos of the house attached to the listing. It looked like a very nice, slightly older, 2-story home in a quiet neighborhood. But the most appealing part for her was that Jackson did not require a background check. To a 21-year-old who felt trapped, this seemed like the ultimate escape route. She did not bother asking her friends or her family for their advice. She knew they would tell her it was a terrible idea, and she was tired of being told what to do. So, she took a deep breath and sent a message to the number listed on the ad. Jackson replied within just a few minutes. He was incredibly polite and answered all of her basic questions about the house and the expectations. However, very early in their text conversation, Jackson asked her what her gender was. When she replied that she was a young woman, his messages suddenly became much longer and more enthusiastic. At the time, she did not think anything of it. She reasoned that most people would probably prefer to have a female house cleaner, because they might view women as more detail-oriented or reliable. She was willing to overlook almost anything if it meant she could pack her bags and leave her parents' house. Jackson explained that he would be out of the house for work most of the day, but he wanted to come home to a clean space. He also mentioned that he would appreciate a hot meal waiting for him after a long shift, and he promised to pay for all of the groceries himself. To her, this sounded like an absolute dream compared to standing behind the vape shop counter for minimum wage. Jackson suggested that she come over to the house that very afternoon to look at the place and see if it was a good fit for her. She agreed immediately, got into her old, beat-up Civic, and drove over to the address he provided. The house was located in a perfectly normal, quiet neighborhood. The street was lined with neat lawns, and the surrounding homes had colorful flowers and decorations on their porches, which made her feel much more comfortable. She walked up to the front door and rang the bell. When the door opened, she was surprised by the man standing on the threshold. Based on his messages, she had pictured a typical, middle-aged dad, maybe 45 years old and clean-cut. Instead, the man standing before her was around 60 years old, over 6 feet tall, with a long gray beard and a heavy build. He was much larger than she had expected, but he had a massive, friendly smile on his face. Before she could even introduce herself, he stepped forward and pulled her into a warm hug. It was a bit surprising, but his booming laugh and easygoing energy quickly put her mind at ease. He began to lead her through the house for a tour. The first floor had a spacious kitchen, a cozy dining room, and a comfortable living room. Then, he led her up the wooden staircase to the second floor, which had 4 bedrooms and a single bathroom. During the tour, Jackson only opened 2 doors upstairs. He showed her the clean, sunlit guest bedroom that would be hers, and the shared bathroom next door. The other doors along the hallway remained shut. He mentioned that one of the closed rooms was an office, and he told her she was welcome to use it if she ever needed to. The other closed door was his master bedroom, and there was one more door that he simply did not explain or acknowledge. She noticed that it was a bit unusual for a 4-bedroom house to only have one bathroom, but she was too polite to ask about it. Finally, he took her down to the basement. He explained that the basement was unfinished, and that he only went down there to do his laundry or to work out. With the tour complete, she decided right then and there that she wanted the job. Jackson smiled warmly and told her she was hired on the spot. 2 days later, she packed up all of her belongings in the back of her Civic. When her parents asked where she was going, she simply told them she had found an apartment and was moving out. She did not give them any details, and they did not ask. Her first night in the house was when she experienced her very first moment of unease. She was sitting in the living room, trying to get used to the quiet atmosphere of her new surroundings, when she looked up and noticed something small and black mounted in the corner of the ceiling. It was a security camera. She got up and walked into the kitchen, and sure enough, there was another camera mounted in the corner of that room as well. The cameras were not hidden, and they were pointing directly at the main living spaces. She tried to rationalize this in her mind. She told herself that she was essentially a stranger living in this man's house, so it made perfect sense for him to want some security to protect his property. Still, she could not help but wish he had mentioned the cameras before she moved in. She tried to push the weird feeling aside, reminding herself of how much she wanted this arrangement to work out. That night, as she lay in bed in the dark guest room, she realized how incredibly noisy the old house was. In the silence of the night, every little sound was amplified. She could hear the wooden floorboards creaking as the temperature shifted. But then, at around 1:30 in the morning, she heard a distinct sound that made her freeze. It sounded exactly like a door quietly closing somewhere on the first floor. She stared at the ceiling, telling herself that older houses always make strange noises, and that she was just being paranoid. The next morning, when she woke up, Jackson was already gone. He had left a neatly written note on the kitchen counter, along with a list of chores he wanted completed. The tasks were completely standard. He wanted her to wash a load of laundry, vacuum the carpets, and wipe down the kitchen counters. She spent the morning focusing entirely on her work, grateful that she was no longer dealing with difficult customers at the vape shop. After finishing the cleaning, she went up to her bedroom to make it feel more like her own home. She unpacked her favorite clothes, set up her laptop on the small desk, and arranged a few personal decorations. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. There were no parents yelling at her, and no one was barging into her room to demand things from her. The first week passed without any major incidents. Every evening, when Jackson returned home from work, they would have polite, casual conversations. He asked her about her childhood, her dreams for the future, and how she was settling in. She cooked dinner for him a few nights in a row, and he seemed very appreciative of her efforts. She began to think that her initial fears about the cameras and the strange night noises were completely unfounded. But that peaceful feeling did not last. One evening, she decided to make a meal of chicken pasta with mixed vegetables. She was not a professional chef by any means, and her cooking skills were basic at best. When Jackson walked through the front door, he looked visibly exhausted and highly irritable. He sat down at the dining table, took a single bite of the food she had prepared, and his expression instantly darkened. He set his fork down with a loud clatter and looked directly at her, his face tight with anger. He told her that the pasta tasted completely bland and was barely edible. She was taken aback by his sudden hostility and quickly apologized, offering to add some seasoning or make him something else entirely. But Jackson snapped. He stood up from the table, towering over her, and said that if she was going to live in his house for free, the very least she could do was learn how to cook a decent meal. He shoved the plate away, leaving it on the table, and told her to clean up the mess she had made, before he turned around and walked down the hallway to his bedroom. The sheer speed of his personality shift left her completely stunned. He had gone from a friendly, smiling man to an angry, demanding authority figure in a matter of seconds. She cleaned up the kitchen in complete silence, trying to convince herself that he was just having a bad day at work. The next morning, she wanted to keep the peace, so she approached him in the kitchen to apologize again. She told him she was sorry about the dinner and promised to try harder next time. Jackson suddenly let out a loud laugh, acting as if his anger from the night before had never happened. He waved his hand dismissively and told her not to worry about it. But then, his smile changed into something that made her stomach drop. He looked at her and said that maybe she could make it up to him by cleaning the house in her underwear that day. He said it with a casual grin, as if it were a harmless joke. She froze, completely unsure of how to respond to such a bizarre and highly inappropriate comment. She managed to find her voice and told him quite clearly that she was not comfortable with that. Jackson just laughed again, patted her shoulder, and told her to relax because he was only joking. Then he grabbed his things and walked out the door. She stood in the empty kitchen, feeling a deep sense of dread. For the first time, she had to admit to herself that there was something deeply wrong with this living situation. She took out her phone and sent a long text to one of her closest friends, explaining everything that had happened, including the underwear comment. Her friend replied almost instantly, telling her that she was completely insane for staying in that house and begging her to pack her bags and leave immediately. But she was stubborn. She felt that if she went back to her parents' house, she would be admitting defeat, and she simply could not bear the thought of going back to that toxic environment. She decided to stay, hoping things would get better. The following Monday, Jackson left some cash on the counter for groceries, and she got into her Civic to drive to the local supermarket. While she was driving down a busy street, she noticed a sedan behind her. The driver was laying on the horn and flashing their lights. She assumed she had accidentally cut them off, but the car continued to follow her closely, turning down every street she took. Terrified, she finally pulled over to the side of the road, expecting an angry driver to confront her. The sedan pulled up right behind her Civic, and a young woman who looked to be about her own age got out of the vehicle. She walked quickly up to her window, and when she rolled it down, the woman asked her directly if she was currently living at Jackson's house. When she answered yes, the young woman's face became incredibly serious. She told her that she needed to pack her bags and get as far away from that man as possible. She revealed that Jackson was not even his real name. The young woman explained that she was the previous housekeeper, who had lived under the exact same arrangement just a few weeks prior. She said she had initially thought the setup was perfect, but she quickly realized that Jackson was using the security cameras to monitor her every move, even when he claimed to be at work. She said he would constantly text her about things she was doing in the house that he could only know if he was actively watching the camera feeds. When she eventually told him she was leaving, he became extremely aggressive, demanding to know where she was going, and making it incredibly difficult for her to gather her things. Then, the young woman shared the most terrifying details. She said that one night, she woke up in the middle of the night and saw Jackson standing silently in the darkness of her bedroom, just staring at her. When she moved, he quickly slipped out of the room. She also discovered that Jackson did not actually have a job. He would leave the house in the morning to make it look like he was going to work. But he would secretly return and hide inside one of those locked rooms upstairs, or in the unfinished basement, watching her through the camera feeds, while she believed she was completely alone in the house. Hearing this made her feel physically ill. She realized that all of the strange creaking floorboards and the doors closing in the middle of the night were not the house settling. It was Jackson, moving around the house while she slept. She asked the young woman how she could possibly escape without causing a dangerous confrontation. The girl advised her to act completely normal, to slowly and secretly smuggle her most valuable belongings out of the house in small bags, and to make her final departure look like a routine trip to run errands. When she drove back to the house, the entire building looked different to her. It no longer felt like a sanctuary, it felt like a trap. She walked through the front door and immediately felt the heavy, invisible weight of the cameras watching her. Remembering the young woman's warning about Jackson hiding in the house, she realized she was never truly alone. She went up to her bedroom and decided to inspect the space very carefully. She began searching the corners, the underside of the desk, and the shelves. When she looked on the top shelf of her closet, pushed far back into the darkest corner, she noticed a small cardboard box. She moved the box slightly and gasped. Tucked behind it was a tiny black camera lens, pointing directly through a small hole that had been carefully drilled into the closet door. The camera had a clear, unobstructed view of her entire bed. She felt a wave of absolute horror wash over her, but she forced herself to put the box back exactly as she had found it. Knowing that Jackson might be watching her discover it, she did not sleep a single wink that night. She lay perfectly still in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the house, with her heart pounding in her chest. At some point in the early hours of the morning, she heard the unmistakable sound of her bedroom door handle slowly turning. The door creaked open just a few inches. In the dim light from the hallway, she saw the silhouette of Jackson standing in the doorway, staring in at her. She immediately rolled over on her side and looked directly at him. Jackson froze, realizing she was awake. He quickly offered a half-hearted apology, claiming he was just checking to make sure she was okay, and then he quietly closed the door. In that moment, she knew she had to get out immediately. The very next morning, she began her escape plan. Every time she left the house to go to the store or to the vape shop, she would carry one small, inconspicuous bag of her belongings and hide it in the trunk of her car. She did this for 3 days, acting as normal as possible when Jackson was around. On the 4th day, while Jackson was supposedly at work, she packed the very last of her things, got into her Civic, and drove away, never looking back. Later that afternoon, she received a text from Jackson asking where she was. She replied with a simple message, stating that she had decided to move back in with her parents, and thanking him for the opportunity. Jackson immediately bombarded her phone with texts, demanding to know why she was leaving so suddenly, and insisting that she return to the house to talk to him in person. She blocked his number and never replied. About a week later, she received an email alert notifying her that someone had repeatedly tried to log into one of her old social media accounts. The security log showed that the login attempts were originating from the very same town where Jackson's house was located. She immediately changed all of her passwords and security settings. To this day, she does not know what Jackson's true intentions were, but she is entirely convinced that if she had stayed in that house any longer, something terrible would have happened to her. She realizes now that the promise of free rent was nothing more than bait to lure vulnerable young women into a highly sophisticated and dangerous trap of surveillance and psychological control. Our second story takes place in a quiet residential neighborhood where a young man had recently achieved his dream of buying his very first home. It was a charming 2-story house, and while it was relatively small, it was still far more space than he actually needed as a single man living alone. He worked incredibly long hours at his demanding job, often leaving early in the morning and not returning until late in the evening. Because of his exhausting schedule, he began to notice that he was falling desperately behind on his household chores. The kitchen counters were dusty, the floors needed a thorough scrubbing, and the house began to feel cluttered. He realized that he simply did not have the time or the energy to keep the place clean. One evening, after a particularly long shift, he was scrolling through Craigslist, hoping to find an independent housekeeper who could help him manage the chores. He found a listing for a local cleaner who offered flexible schedules and accepted cash payments. He decided to send her an email. The next morning, a woman replied to his message. She explained that she typically cleaned smaller apartments, but she was more than happy to take on a 2-story house. They agreed on a price and set up a day for her to come over while he was at work. Before the scheduled day, she asked him a few routine questions, such as the size of the house, whether he had any pets, and if anyone else lived there. He told her that he had no pets, that the house was quite small, and that he lived entirely alone. Looking back on that conversation, he deeply regretted sharing that last detail so casually with a complete stranger. On the following Thursday, the cleaner arrived at his house. He met her briefly at the front door before he had to leave for his shift. Before she arrived, he had taken the precaution of locking all of his valuable items, documents, and electronics inside his office closet, which had a sturdy lock on it. The cleaner appeared to be about 38 years old. She was very quiet, avoided eye contact, and seemed quite shy. He showed her around the house, pointing out the areas he wanted cleaned, but he specifically told her that she did not need to enter his private office. He showed her where the cleaning supplies were kept in the laundry room, and before he left, she asked him what time he usually returned home from work. He told her he usually got back around 6 or 7 in the evening. When he returned home that night, he was absolutely thrilled with her work. The entire house smelled fresh and clean, the wooden floors were shining, and the kitchen was spotless. He paid her the agreed cash amount, and she left. Everything seemed perfectly normal. For about a week, everything was good. Then it started maybe 6 nights later. He woke up around 2 or 3 in the morning. He was not a great sleeper, so this was not unusual for him. What was unusual was that he thought he heard a soft thump from downstairs. It sounded like maybe something settling or one of those random house noises you hear at night. Put simply, he ignored it as most people do when they hear these sounds. A couple of nights later he woke up again, and this time he heard what sounded like a cabinet door closing downstairs. Again, he just assumed he was half asleep and imagining things. He did not go check. He definitely was not going to walk around a dark house at 3 in the morning, over something that was probably nothing. He truly wished he had. Over the next week, he started noticing small things that felt slightly off, but not enough to really alarm him. One morning, a kitchen cabinet door was open a few inches. He figured maybe he had left it that way without thinking. Another time, a chair at his dining room table seemed pulled out slightly. Again, he assumed he must have done it. One Saturday morning, he noticed that the downstairs bathroom hand towel felt damp. Stuff like that kept happening. Small things that you could always explain away if you wanted to. Then the nighttime sounds kept happening, always soft enough to explain away. Once it sounded like a single, slow footstep, but he convinced himself it was probably the wood floors adjusting to the temperature change. He started sleeping with his bedroom door shut, instead of cracked open like he usually did. He did not want to admit that he was getting uneasy, but he was. One night, he woke up and was almost sure he heard movement right outside his bedroom door, like pressure being shifted in the wooden floorboards. He still did not get up. He just stared at his closed door, waiting to see if the handle would move. He was starting to get that paranoid, but nothing happened, and eventually, he fell back asleep. The next morning, he felt stupid for even being scared. He checked the entire house, and everything looked completely normal. Around this time, he texted the cleaner again about coming back, since overall she did a good job, and he figured maybe he was just stressed out from his long hours at work. She came again on another weekday while he was at work. It was the exact same routine. He left the back door unlocked for her. When he got home, everything looked incredibly clean again. She asked if he wanted to schedule something regular. He told her maybe once a month. Anything more than that seemed like a waste of money to me, he thought at the time. About a week after that second cleaning, he started noticing that his food seemed to be disappearing slightly faster than it should have been. It felt like he was losing his mind one night, swearing to himself that there was at least one more yogurt cup in the fridge the previous night, and now it was completely gone. The bread slices seemed lower than he remembered, too. He was still trying to explain these things away, though, but one morning, he found a clean drinking glass sitting in the sink that he was almost positive he had not used. He lived alone and was single at the time, so there really was no one else it could have been. At one point, he wondered if maybe he was doing these things half asleep and not remembering. He even Googled stuff about sleepwalking and late-night eating, desperately searching for any scientific explanation that would allow him to feel safe in his own home. Things really changed one night when he woke up and clearly heard slow, deliberate footsteps downstairs. He knew what footsteps sound like compared to house settling noises. These were footsteps. He grabbed his phone and stopped to listen for a second. After maybe 10 seconds, he heard what sounded like something lightly bumping into a wall on the first floor. He did not go downstairs. He knows some people might think that sounds stupid or cowardly, but fear really does make you freeze sometimes instead of act. Or maybe he was picking flight over fight before even confronting the situation. He just stayed in bed, sitting up for half an hour, not hearing anything again, and finally convincing himself it was nothing. Looking back, he looks at himself as a coward for that decision. Morning came, and that day he checked all the doors and windows. Everything was securely locked. He even checked his basement, even though he had never heard any sounds coming from down there. It was completely clear a few days later he noticed something that really bothered him. In his kitchen junk drawer, where he kept random things like batteries and takeout menus, he also kept 2 spare house keys on a small brass ring. One of them was completely gone. He got goosebumps when he considered the obvious possibility, but he kept telling himself that it was not possible. He searched the entire house from top to bottom, but he could not find the missing key. The cleaner had been alone in the house twice, for several hours each time. He started locking his bedroom door at night after that discovery. About 4 nights later, he decided to test a theory. He left for work like normal in the morning, but after driving just a few blocks, he circled back and parked his car on the next street over. He walked back quietly and went in through his back door. He stayed upstairs and just waited. Around 11 in the morning, he heard something. He heard the distinct sound of his front door unlocking. He heard very soft, quiet footsteps come inside. He moved slowly to where he could see part of the downstairs hallway through the stair railing. He looked down and saw a woman. It looked like her, the cleaner. She just walked in like she lived there. She did not even have any cleaning supplies with her. She went into his kitchen, opened the fridge, took out a drink, and sat down at his dining table. She sat there quietly for a few minutes, slowly sipping the drink. Then, she stood up and began walking slowly around his living room, looking at his things. She picked up a framed photo of him and his brother, and just stared at it for a moment. Then she began walking toward the stairs. He backed up as quietly as he could into his bedroom, and shut the door without making a single sound. He honestly did not know what to do. His heart was beating so hard, he was afraid she would hear it through the door. He did not want her to know he was home yet. After maybe a minute, he heard her walk halfway up the stairs and then stop. He could see her dark shadow under his door. She just stood there, not moving at all, as if she knew he was on the other side of that door. It felt like at least a full minute of pure, agonizing silence. With his mind racing and adrenaline flooding his system, he decided it was now or never to confront her. He grabbed the handle and flung the door open. He was not expecting her to actually already be standing mere feet away from the door, looking directly at it, and now looking at him. But he quickly realized, now that he had a closer look, that it was not the same lady he had hired. It was another Hispanic lady, yes, but her build, her hair, and her face were all completely different. There was something so bone-chilling about her face. She had this blank, nearly angry, and hateful look in her eyes. He did not say a single word, and neither did she. They just stood there in the narrow hallway for a few seconds, staring at each other. Then, she slowly turned around and walked back down the stairs like absolutely nothing had happened. He heard his front door open and close a few seconds later. His heart was pounding and he was shaking. He thinks he was genuinely too nervous and shook to move or say a single word to her. He waited about 5 minutes before he could even bring himself to move. Dialing 911 was almost difficult with how shaky his fingers were. The police came, and he explained everything that had happened. He explained that there were 2 different women involved. He gave them the phone number and the email address of the original cleaning lady and any other information he could provide. The original cleaning lady stopped responding completely after that day, and her digital accounts were deactivated. He replaced every single lock in the house that very same day. Literally right after the police left, he went straight to the hardware store to buy new deadbolts. What still bothers him to this day is the officer asking him if he had given anyone else a key, to which he answered no. The officer told him that sometimes people like that do not work alone, and they use housekeeping ads as a way to copy keys and access homes. He never hired another cleaner again, preferring to do all the work himself rather than risk letting another stranger into his sanctuary. Our third story takes place in 2008, a time when Craigslist was the Wild West. The protagonist was a 22-year-old young man who was trusting and reckless. After his girlfriend abruptly dumped him and kicked him out, he crashed at his friend's house. Making only $7 an hour, he decided to look for cheap furniture on Craigslist to fill a future apartment. His buddy let him store his purchases in a large garage. Soon, he found a listing from a man named Keith, selling a whole sectional sofa for $45. He messaged Keith, who explained he was moving to another state. They agreed to meet at 9 o'clock that night at Keith's house. He pulled up to a desolate, dark block with no streetlights. Keith's house was completely dark. When he called Keith, the number was out of service. Just as he was about to leave, his phone rang from a different area code. Keith claimed he had broken his phone and was calling from his work cell. He told the young man to walk to the back door. He went around the dark house and heard a phone ringing in the overgrown bushes. Keith emerged from the brush, claiming he was feeding squirrels. Keith was thin, with a dirty ponytail, and smelled like cigarettes. He led him to the back door but struggled to open it. Keith asked him to use his shoulder and push the door as hard as he could. He leaned his entire body and shoulder into the old door, but it was suddenly pulled open from the inside. He fell onto the dark floor and Keith yelled, "Now!" Two large men emerged and pinned him down. As he struggled, Keith began kicking his face. He heard Keith tell the men to grab tape. But during the struggle, his phone accidentally redialed his friend. Hearing his friend's voice, he yelled that he was in the back and needed help. The attackers hesitated, thinking he had backup. He broke free, ran to his car, and sped away. Seeing the bald attacker try to grab his door, he just kept driving for hours, terrified that they would follow him. The old house was empty when police arrived, and the listing was gone forever. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.